So I've always liked animals I could kind of study and imprison in jam jars and look at my leisure. So when the chance to study earthworms came up, I leapt at it. And also they're quite simple creatures relative to mammals, for example, and they do things in a different way. And it's quite an interesting, how do they move? They haven't even got legs. And I didn't actually know very much about them, which, considering I'd done a degree in zoology at that time, plenty of scope to find out new things.
Well, yes, there's so much to be found out about all sorts of things, isn't there?
Yes.
Okay, do you want to hit us with your presentation then?
Okay, yeah. So
we'll add it to the stream.
Lovely.
Okay, well, I'll go away and leave you to talk about it. Okay? Right, you just go out when you want the slide changed.
Will do, yeah. I'll say something like, let's have a look at this. And I don't want to go to the recent government thing of always having to say next slide, please, because okay, so we're pondering the question of how to account for consciousness. So a good place to start is probably with a definition. What are we talking about? What does the word consciousness mean? A variety of definitions have been proposed, so let's have a look. Here are some of them. So first one, awareness, the difference between being awake and being asleep or in a coma. Another one, perceptual awareness, the awareness of the world around you. Internal awareness, the recognition that you yourself exist. A philosopher called John Locke described consciousness as the perception of what passes in a man's own mind. Another definition, quite an influential one, by a philosopher called Thomas Nagel, is that a system is conscious if there's something it is like to be that system. And another definition is a rather sort of basic one, a continual stream of sensory data. Let's have a look now at how people have tried to study it. So the first and oldest method is introspection, thinking about one's own mind in order to try and determine the laws of its operation. One good thing about this method is that it needs no fancy apparatus. It could therefore be applied even by ancient philosophers. Another good thing about it is it's the most direct way we have of accessing consciousness. There seems to be something private or subjective about consciousness, such that my conscious thoughts can only be directly experienced by my mind. A problem with introspection, though, is that it led different thinkers to different definitions of consciousness and different conclusions concerning it. A more recent school of thought within psychology is behaviorism, the idea that we should study inputs and resulting behavior, or stimuli and responses, rigorously and objectively. A strict behaviorist would treat consciousness as a black box, unworthy of scientific study because it can't be objectively observed from the outside. On the plus side, this way of doing psychology allows for very rigorous, controlled, and relatively objective types of experiment, and also repeatable experiments. The downside, though, from the point of view of consciousness research, is that it's too strict. Factors like emotions and expectations aren't incorporated or explained. And for many people, the existence of their own conscious states is the most obvious, important, and undeniable thing in the world. The French mathematician and philosopher Rene Descartes famously regarded his immediate conscious thoughts as being the basis of all the rest of his knowledge, arguing, "I think, therefore I am." Cognitive psychology aims to study the processes by which sensory inputs are transformed, reduced, elaborated, stored, recovered, and used. Drawing on insights from computer science, mental processes such as problem solving, learning, and memory could be conceived of in terms of information processing, a development that gave new respectability to the study of internal mental states like consciousness. Technological advances, such as those in medical imaging, held out the prospect of measuring, if not consciousness directly, physical correlates of it. Let's look now at how consciousness might be explained. One option is something called substance dualism. This holds that there are two kinds of stuff: material stuff that isn't conscious, and a non-material, let's call it spiritual stuff, in which a cause of consciousness resides. Most people in the past were, and many people today still are, religious. Substance dualism fits in with religious ways of thinking, and historically this is the way that many people have thought. Substance dualism also offers the prospect of a non-material realm, and therefore a means by which people believed they could survive the death of their physical bodies. Granted, if we one day understand the mind in purely physical terms, we might in principle be able to secure a digital afterlife for ourselves by uploading our thoughts onto a computer, although that does seem like rather a distant prospect at the moment. Another option, as you can see on the right, is substance monism, the idea that there's only one type of stuff. Now, the phrase type of stuff needs to be clarified. Scientists conceive of several different types of subatomic particle, as well as such things as fields. But these can be termed all the same type of stuff in the sense that they're all physical. The idea that everything is physical is a type of substance monism called physicalism. According to this way of thinking, mental states arise from physical processes. They aren't sort of separate. Let's have a look now at some problems with substance dualism. Substance dualism, the idea that there are two types of stuff, is more complex than substance monism. It requires an extra realm in comparison. It risks falling foul of a principle called Occam's razor. Entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. Why make an explanation more complex than it needs to be? Why invoke a spiritual realm as well as a natural one, given that a natural one alone seems to do a pretty good job? As Richard Dawkins put it, it really comes down to parsimony, economy of explanation. It's possible that your car engine is driven by psychokinetic energy, but if it looks like a petrol engine, smells like a petrol engine, and performs exactly as well as a petrol engine, the sensible working hypothesis is that it is a petrol engine. Telepathy and possession by spirits of the dead are not ruled out as a matter of principle. There's certainly nothing impossible about abductions by aliens in UFOs. One day it may happen. But on the grounds of probability, it should be kept as an explanation of last resort. It's unparsimonious, demanding more than routinely weak evidence before we should believe it. If you hear hooves clip-clopping down a London street, it could be a zebra or even a unicorn. But before we assume that it's anything other than a horse, we should demand a certain minimal standard of evidence. The second problem, and it's related, is that supernatural explanations don't have a good track record. Many things that were once regarded as having a supernatural cause are now widely regarded as being natural phenomena. Epilepsy, for example, was once thought to have been caused by demons, but is now regarded as a natural phenomenon. The adaptive complexity of living things was likewise once regarded as the work of a supernatural designer, but is now attributed to natural processes, namely random mutations and natural selection, in which the environment effectively filters out the less well-adapted things in a non-random but natural way. If there are two different types of stuff, a ghost in the machine, another problem concerns the question of how these two realms or types interact. Mental processes seem to be correlated to physical processes in the brain. How does this correlation come about? Suppose physical activity in the brain conveys information to an immaterial spirit. How does this happen? And how does the spirit, the ghost in the machine, having decided what to do, go about pushing the machine's physical levers to get the actions that it wants? If levers are pushed by spirits, how is there room for this to happen, given that the physical world appears to be bound by conservation laws, such as the conservation of energy? A philosopher called Leibniz claimed that mental events were neither causes nor effects of any physical event, but that the two were nonetheless related because God had synchronized them. But if the mental doesn't affect the physical, of what practical use are mental phenomena? Substance dualism can be vulnerable to what's called the Homunculus Problem. The word homunculus comes from the Latin for little man, and the homunculus problem arises when we seek to explain some aspect of human agency by positing what's effectively another agent, or little man, inside us. We've already met one example of this, the idea that epileptic fits are caused by demons. Even if true, this idea can only offer a partial explanation for epilepsy. Okay, epilepsy is caused by demons, but what was it in the demon's mind that made the demon choose to possess a human and so cause the seizures? Another example of a homunculus is the ghost in the machine. Okay, so there's a ghost or spirit inside my head that makes me do stuff. But what is it in the ghost's mind that makes the ghost make me do stuff? Computational theories of the mind can potentially avoid the homunculus problem because each step in the proposed conscious-making process is simple and is executed as an unconscious result of what came before. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that we're aware because we have a spirit. There are times when we're not aware, for example, when we're asleep but not dreaming. Would believers in the spiritual conclude that people at such times must be lacking a spirit? Probably not, but such people then would have to accept that having a spirit is not a sufficient cause of awareness, for they believe that some people that have spirits aren't always aware. It might be claimed that spirits sleep at the same time that we do, but note how even if this were the case, the homunculus problem raises its head again. What is it that explains why a spirit's own mind gains or loses consciousness? Suppose, for the sake of argument, that spiritual beings such as angels exist. Suppose also that an angel has an accident one day. It accidentally chops off its own finger. It's reasonable to suppose that the angel's mind realizes that the finger is missing. It seems unlikely, however, that the angel's finger realizes it's missing a mind. Now, both the angel's finger and its mind are spiritual. However, the angel's isolated finger isn't conscious. So saying it's spiritual is not a sufficient explanation of consciousness, even if spiritual beings are known to exist. What have these thought experiments about sleepy spirits and angelic accidents shown us? That even if spirits do exist, they don't in themselves explain consciousness. We still need to explain why some spiritual things are conscious and others not. Let's have a look now at some problems with the other method of explaining substance, monism. Oh, there we go. Right, so if there's only one type of stuff, how is it that some physical stuff is conscious and other physical stuff isn't? This is a bit like the question we asked of the angels. How does consciousness arise? How could a loving, caring, conscious whole arrive from nothing but uncaring, unconscious parts? How could this happen, even in principle? After all, if you have lots of red Lego bricks and build a wall, the resulting wall must be red and not some other colour. The whole resembles its parts. Let's look at why these ways of thinking are unsound. If you could show the next slide, please. These arguments are unsound for two reasons. Firstly, they commit what philosophers call the fallacy of composition. The assumption that the whole must resemble its parts is true in the case of red bricks making a red wall, but is false in many other cases. For example, triangular bricks could be used to build a hexagon rather than a triangle. In one sense, the hexagon on the right is nothing but 6 triangles. In another sense, however, a hexagon is different to a triangle. A hexagon has got 6 sides and a triangle's only got 3. When trying to explain the whole, we must look not merely at what the parts are, but at how they're arranged. Failure to do this, focusing on what something is made of without considering how those parts are arranged, leads to a fallacy called the Moto-Hock fallacy. Moto-Hock is Latin for just this. The fallacy is also known as nothing buttery. A hexagon is made up of nothing but 6 triangles. So, in one sense, a hexagon is nothing but 6 triangles. In another sense, though, a hexagon has got properties that no individual triangle has. And if you overlook that fact, you've committed the Moto-Hock fallacy. Let's look now at a simple mechanical example of emergence, namely a chain. Each link in a chain is difficult to bend, but the chain itself as a whole is very flexible. Flexibility is an example of what's known as an emergent phenomenon. It's present at the level of the whole, but absent in each part. How does flexibility arise? Well, there's a sense in which the answer to this question isn't natural. I'm not trying to argue here that a chain's flexibility is supernatural. All I mean to say is that the flexibility arises because of what's not there rather than because of what is. Each link is a loop tightly joined to itself, but there's nothing physically joining one link to the other one, to another one, so the links are free to slide over one another to some degree. The flexibility arises not because of some magical supernatural property, but because of the lack of something physical. You could, in principle, start with a solid block of metal, carve a chain out of it, and watch the arrangement become more flexible as more and more of the metal is machined away from the block. Emergence is actually very common. Water, a non-flammable liquid, is made by combining 2 highly combustible gases, hydrogen and oxygen. It doesn't sound like a very promising recipe, but there we are. But all we've done so far is establish that a physical cause for consciousness isn't necessarily false, because consciousness might be emergent. But can we go further than this? Is there something about consciousness that should make us think not merely that consciousness might be emergent, but that it probably is? Yes, let's have a look at the next slide. The first thing is that consciousness involves detection, and detection involves a relationship between the detector and that which is detected. And relationships are emergent. Relationships occur between 2 or more things. You can't have a relationship if you have only one thing. For example, goodness of fit describes the relationship between a key and a lock. A key can't be a good fit unless there's a lock to fit it. Also of relevance is the fact that the things we know to be conscious are complex, and all the things we regard as being unconscious are simple. If mental phenomena are ultimately to be explained in a non-circular way, they must be explained in terms of non-mental phenomena, and it's a significant fact that all known non-mental phenomena are physical. Let's have a look at another potential problem. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. Now, the hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why and how we have qualia. Qualia are first-person experiences that feel like something. But do we actually have qualia? If we don't, the hard problem vanishes. It's very important to stress that the denial of qualia is not the same as the denial of feelings. I don't think anyone here could seriously deny that they have feelings. The question at issue is not whether we have experiences, but whether those experiences can meaningfully be said to feel like something. Let's have a look at a point made by a philosopher called Peter Hacker. And he said that the question of why is seeing red like seeing this, and then looking at something red, is misguided. Firstly, seeing red doesn't resemble the process of looking at a red thing. It is the process of looking at a red thing. And secondly, the only cogent answer to the confused question, why is seeing red like this, is that seeing something that's red is seeing red because that's the color we call red. So what he's saying, the first point is the clearer one of the two, that seeing red doesn't resemble seeing a red thing, it is seeing a red thing. If seeing red is the result of running a mental process, then seeing red isn't like that process, it simply is that process. Working on an analogy to make that point clearer, because it's not sort of immediately obvious, but I'm working on analogies just to make sure that point is sound. But that's an interesting thought, which I only came across recently, actually, in doing the research for this talk. I'd always assumed that qualia had meant feelings, but it's a bit more specific than that. It's a feeling that is like, it's an experience that is like something. Okay, so that's the end of the talk. If anyone has any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Rob. You've obviously done a lot of work on this for us. Very kind. Now, we've got one or two questions coming in. I've got some comments to make from what you said as well. And I've also got my notes on a lecture given by Steven Pinker, which I attended a couple of years ago.
Oh,
I was lucky enough to find out it was held in London. In one of there's a couple of London University lecture rooms that hold these events. I can't remember which one it was, but that's where it was held, and it was staged by A.C. Grayling, you know, the master of the New College of Humanities, yes, who's a friend of Steven Pinker, and set this up as an event for us. It was aimed at children, school children. It was part of the STEM initiative to try and enthuse people into studying science. So I'll go through that in a minute, but I wanted to mention that William of Ockham,
yes,
of razor fame, he lived just up the road from here.
He was a monk as well, wasn't he?
Well, sort of. It wasn't quite a monk. It was a friar, I think, a friar, similar sort of profession. But yeah, the village of Ockham is in South Surrey, up the A29. So they spell it differently now. Oh, right. It's OCKHAM. But it's the same place. That's where he resided for most of his life. So yeah, I liked your parts of an angel are all spiritual, but not all of them can be conscious. I like sort of simple thought experiments, because one problem you find when you're talking with religious people is if you start going on about scientific explanations, their minds glaze over. You know, they're not receptive. Whereas if you give them thought experiments based on what they believe in, like I suppose the idea of an angel chopping its finger off might be pushing it a bit, but even if we say, okay, let's say that Satan's in hell prodding you with a trident, you know, it's a spiritual. Satan's a spiritual being. Hell's a spiritual place. You're spiritually resurrected there, and there's a spiritual trident, and the trident isn't conscious. So why is Satan's mind conscious and the trident not, if they're both spiritual things? Because they'll give us sort of, it's spiritual. I've explained it, and I think a big problem is that when religion offers explanations, it doesn't go into any detail. You know, if you say sort of, God created the first man by getting some earth together and breathing life-giving breath into him, well, if a creationist can get away with that level of detail, then what right have they to demand like a stepwise process by which, say, a non-living thing became alive? I might just as well say nature gathered stuff in a primordial soup and give no more detail. And scientists are working on more detail because they always want to have a more precise understanding of stuff. And they haven't kidded themselves into thinking they've cracked it. But religious people very often give a very simple explanation that's got no depth or very little depth to it. Yes.
And that comes in with the sort of the problem with angels, you know, sort of, consciousness is a bit weird. I can't immediately see how nature could do it. So supernature did it. Well, even if that's true, how did supernature do it? How did supernatural do it?
We want a mechanism.
Yes, I'm not sure if mechanism is quite the right word for the supernatural.
Well, some
explanation, a detailed explanation.
Yeah, but you're right, though. I mean, nobody would consider an angel's finger to be conscious. Surely the consciousness would reside somewhere else in an angel. So that brings up that point, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now, the trouble with the word spirit is, of course, it's got a lot of different meanings.
Yes.
So
the word in terms of English, the word spirit is related to words like inspire. So it's got that sort of an intake of breath. And the same is actually true in Hebrew, in which the Genesis narrative was written. So, and of course, it's easy to understand why people would associate breathing with consciousness, and well, maybe not consciousness because you still breathe when you're asleep, but consciousness in terms of when you die, you stop breathing. I mean, that's putting it rather crudely, because you could be on a respirator or something. But in the ancient world, if you stopped breathing, you were probably a goner. It's a pretty good relationship, but it's a pretty good proxy for being alive, the fact that you're breathing. So it's not surprising that people associated the being alive, the consciousness, an important aspect of being alive, with breathing. There's a very close relationship between the two. So you can see why, to be fair to the people who wrote this, they would do it. It was sort of proto-science. They were doing their best to explain something. It's a start. Life comes from breath. Well, it's sort of bound up with oxygen and, if you're aerobic anyway, it's bound up with releasing energy through respiration. It's bound up with oxygen, but it perhaps it doesn't come from breath in quite the same way that they thought it did.
But then there's spirit in the sense of a gaseous thing, isn't there? I mean, like methylated spirit or spirits of salts that they used to refer to, which was hydrochloric acid, I believe.
Yes.
And then, of course, you can behave in a spirited way if you're sort of gambling about and happy.
Yes. It means sort of great intention or gusto or sort of, and it's spiritual. It's got that higher sort of purposeful connotation.
It's very much a word that you need to have an agreement about before you start discussing.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Because it can mean concerned with questions of importance and value, or it can mean it can sort of imply belief in the supernatural. It's got a wide range of meanings, as you say.
So what about red? I mean, I like that red business, but can't machines see red now? I mean, we can have what are they called? Optometers that recognize particular wavelengths. So
they're certainly detecting correlates of red. So, for example, the wavelength that I associate with my idea of red, they can detect something that correlates to that. And so, in a sense, they could be programmed in a way that corresponds to
your particular view of red.
Yes, it corresponds to my view of red, but it doesn't actually involve. It doesn't. Well, I suppose it might involve it in the sense that I program the computer, but the computer didn't have. The computer itself didn't run it. The program that I made when I asked the computer to see red, I suppose it might have depended on my knowledge of red when I wrote the program and picked the right wavelength. But it doesn't. There's no reason to suppose it's sort of. The question you're raising is whether detection is the same as awareness. I think I would say that you can't have awareness without detection, but I think you can have I think you can have detection without awareness.
Oh, right. That's interesting. Well, I suppose that would be something like you walk out of Sainsbury's and the door opens.
Yes.
But I'm sure it wasn't aware of you.
Well, one point, yes, although you could maybe talk about awareness as being different degrees of detection. Now, so for example, a toilet cistern, when it's filling up, has a means of detecting how high the water level is. It it doesn't know what height is or water or what it's doing.
No.
It's got a one-dimensional kind of detection. It sort of detects it detects one thing that correlates to height, but it gets the job done. As you build up a greater array of sensors, you can detect more. I mean, you're probably familiar with the ideas about how the eye evolved, and from an initial photo spot that couldn't really, a photosensitive spot that couldn't tell even where the light was coming from.
Yeah,
you have a patch of such spots and then curl it up.
Yes,
you get new quantities which aren't available to an individual photoreceptor. For example, you have directionality. The eye could detect where the light is coming from. You have area, which is not really, well, you could have the number of receptors that the light shines on. Whereas if you've only got one photocell, it's all or nothing. You don't have degrees of it.
So what you're doing there is you're illustrating sort of biological emergence, aren't you?
Well, what I'm saying is that as detection becomes more complicated, it allows for detection of more things. And it doesn't really make sense for me to describe a toilet cistern as aware, but it's detecting something. And I think what is a good question is, if you detect lots and lots of stuff and detected that you've detected stuff, can that lead to awareness? Can lots of detection at lots of different levels as well lead to awareness? It's interesting that one critique of attempts to find consciousness is the idea that computers can't really understand, could never be capable of understanding. There's quite a famous thought experiment called the Chinese Room, and a philosopher called John Searle, he came up with the idea. He said that if you had imagine a machine that can pass the Turing test in Chinese. So you give it a question in Chinese and it gives a meaningful answer. It behaves as if it understands Chinese. All right. Now imagine you had a copy of how the machine worked, and the machine's instructions were written in English. You could follow those instructions and answer questions given to you in Chinese, give meaningful answers. But John Searle said, well, if I followed those instructions, I could give meaningful answers to Chinese questions, but I wouldn't be able to understand Chinese.
No.
So it's quite an interesting sort of, and I pondered this for a while, but I think it's just like getting too close to the problem. It's a bit like if you get really close to your television and look at each pixel, you won't know what the picture is. It's a bit like the fallacy of composition. You have to stand back far enough from consisting of pixels to work out what it is. There's that saying, you can't see the woods for the trees. If you're really close to a television, you won't be able to read what's written on it, because the shapes won't even look like letters. If you zoom in really close to one pixel, you'll just see one giant square. And if you're really close to the TV, you'd need a brilliant memory to remember where all the squares were before you could even read.
Assemble them into letters. Yes.
Yeah. If you like attack a problem at the wrong level, then you can't solve it. It's too big for you to solve. Whereas I have no trouble reading normally from a TV, but if I'm too close to it, I'd fail to read it. But I think there's a problem there about the level at which you approach the problem. There are other critiques of the Chinese room argument, but that's one that I find sort of intuitive.
Very interesting. We've had a compliment come in from Frank Lovell. Hello, Frank. Frank is he's in, I believe it's Kentucky. Is it Kentucky, Frank? Just down the road from the Noah's Ark Museum. Lucky you. Frank is telling us he's giving you a compliment. Excellent presentation.
Well, thanks, Frank. Turtles All the Way Down is a classic example of the infinite regress. But of course, physics avoids that problem because what I call downness. It means being attracted to a large nearby object, basically, which in practical terms means the Earth. I suppose you could argue that the Earth would fall into the Sun if it weren't orbiting around it, but it doesn't really make sense to talk about anything being under the Earth. That's the thing, because there's no large nearby object apart from the Earth. So the concept of being under the Earth doesn't make sense.
Yes.
So it's a sort of nonsense question.
Yes.
What's under the Earth?
Yes.
So there's an example of how physics escapes the infinite regress. It simply points out that underneath the Earth is a silly question like north of the North Pole, or
yes,
easy to ask
sometimes,
but it's not. It's easy to ask the question, and some people can be fooled when you ask a question into thinking it's a proper question.
Yes, yes. It doesn't mean it has an answer. It just, if you've formed it into this grammatical structure of a question. I remember many years ago there was a nonsense question. It went like this: what's the difference between a duck?
Well, there's another good example. There's an example of relation.
Yes.
Yes, but a duck and what?
Yes, exactly. And the answer was it's got one leg the same.
Yes, another sort of silly. Yes, because you want to go on the same as. Well, I suppose I said one leg the same is not quite as silly, because you can kind of infer it's the same as the one leg, but again it couldn't be different to one leg logically, could it?
No.
That Peter Hacker philosopher made a point like that about the hard problem of consciousness question, about the qualia question. He sort of thought it was a question that was posed incorrectly. Which sounds like it has an answer, but doesn't when you unpick it. Just as what's holding the Earth up sounds like it ought to have an answer, because most things are held up when you look around, in a sort of inductive sense. Well, what is holding? You can see why people would have asked it, especially if they thought the Earth was flat. But it turns out there's a way of avoiding the infinite regress.
And of course, another odd sort of non-question or not an answerable question is the why question. Why are we here? That's not just a question, it's an assumption. It presumes that there is a reason. There need not be.
Yes, it's a loaded question, in other words, yes.
Yeah. Terry's asking one here. I'm not sure whether we're up to answering this, Terry. How is schizophrenia or schizophrenia, depending, explained in monoism and dualism?
Well, I would guess that the dualism thing, I suppose you could say that there are sort of two demons infecting you, or you've been infected by a demon, so there are two minds in there. That might be, when I say, not all dualists would necessarily believe in demons, but you could imagine someone believing in spiritual agents, and something like schizophrenia. You could understand why people would want to posit an extra agent, because it looks like there's a sort of tussle going on. There's a conflict, maybe I should say.
Yes.
So you could attribute that. If you were a dualist, you could say, well, there's a sort of spiritual. There are two spiritual agents inside your head, not just one homunculus, but two. So yes, so that's how you might do it there. But I suppose, I don't know. I'm not an expert on. I don't know much about how you would explain schizophrenia, but it might be that one part of the brain that would normally recognize where something came from didn't, and therefore attribute it to an outside source. There's an interesting phenomenon called Cotard's delusion, which is the belief that you're dead. It's very rare, but it just strikes me as incredibly weird. An incredibly weird thing, because you go back to sort of the "I think, therefore I am." It sort of seems impossible that you could think you were dead.
Yes.
But it seems that in these cases, people's thoughts are being misattributed by them to something else, so they sort of think they're not real anymore.
Yes.
The thoughts seem sort of distant and disconnected, so they make sense of that feeling by thinking I no longer exist.
God, I'm glad I don't have that problem.
No, it's a very rare Cotard's delusion, and I think it's related to schizophrenia. So it's a sort of, it's the brain misplacing, not associating thoughts with yourself, and therefore associating them with something else.
Terry's reporting here that the Occam's Razor Prize is due soon. Skeptic magazine does that every year. I think it's every year.
Well, I really like that quote that I read out from Richard Dawkins, because a lot of his critics portray him as being sort of narrow-minded, and but it's a very, I don't think he is, and it's a very, that quote is very sort of open-minded. He's saying you shouldn't rule out things like ghosts in your engine pushing it, but you should ask for decent evidence before you bring them in. You should be skeptical of them, and I think that's a good way to proceed. You don't rule things out for no reason, but you don't rule them in for no reason either. You look for a reason first. You look for evidence that rules them in. So a big fan of Occam's Razor.
Yes, me too. Although it's not a rule, it's not a law in any sense, is it?
No, it's a sort of essentially useful principle.
It's a rule of thumb. It seems to work. Yeah.
Well, there are ways of misapplying it, though. So, for example, I could say to you, John, do you believe that consciousness arises because of in the brain, because of the interactions of billions of nerve cells? And you'd say, oh, yes, that's it. Can't go into more detail, but yeah. Well, you believe in billions of things, whereas I just believe that God did it. So I believe in one thing, and you believe in billions of things.
Yes.
You're relying on billions of things, and that's an application of it, because we know that billions of nerve cells exist.
Yes.
God does. So the theist is bringing in one extra thing, and you're not. We both agree that billions of nerve cells exist.
Yes.
We don't agree on whether they cause consciousness.
Yeah.
So it's a game that sometimes people misapply it and say, well, I've heard this argument that you think simple explanations are good. Well, God's simple. You can't get much simpler than that. Well, some people claim God's simple, but I think that's a sort of misapplication of Occam's Razor.
Well, thanks, Terry. That's Terry is one of the key people in our little group of organizers for skeptics, and he's based up in Middlesbrough. I hope things are okay up there, Terry. So Juan Antonio Navarro Pereira. I'm no idea where you are, Juan Antonio, but thank you for watching. What would you think are the main unsolved problems with monism?
Well, I suppose monism is a very broad. I spoke about substance monism, the idea that there's one sort of thing, and I spoke of one particular type of substance monism, the idea that everything's physical. Monism, the word monism just means sort of one type of thing. And you could be a religious person and believe everything is made out of God, for example. That would also be a form of monism, very different to physicalism. So monism is a very broad thing. But to rephrase your question slightly, what do I think physicalism? What are the problems, the main unsolved problems with that? Well, I haven't given an explanation for how consciousness arises. I think. Well, I mean a detailed explanation. I've said it. I said it emerges, but and it does it in a sort of within the framework of monism. But I haven't substance monism. But I haven't given any details at all. What I said there about consciousness emerging. If it's true, it could apply to consciousness in an octopus, perhaps in a computer, perhaps in a person, and it's deliberately unspecified because I don't I don't claim to know the details in any of these cases. I was keeping it deliberately broad because a simple explanation is better than nothing at all, and because I don't claim to be able to give a complex one. So I think more detail on how things become, on how consciousness arises, that's a big. But it's related to what I was talking about. I think that's a problem. Yes.
Well, can I bring in my Steven Pinker notes here, because I think he's a keen monist, materialist. No, that's not it. Let me see if I can get what I want up. Here we go. One minute. And there. Is that readable? It's a bit small.
I need to. I've got it. I haven't got my the wind. Oh, that's better.
Yeah.
Let's have a look. No.
Oh, that wasn't. I thought it would stay big, but apparently not. What he's done there is given an explanation of why the brain is perfectly good enough to be the host of the mind. And you don't need to imagine that there is some separation between the two functions, or between the hardware and the software, if you like, because we know these pieces of evidence. We know that the brain is electrical, and we've got 4 types of evidence for that: tiny electrodes, micro jolts, stimulations of limbs, disabled patients with electrodes enable them to control robots by thinking. I think the latest version of this is actual limbs that they can control by thinking. Robot limbs.
There are other arguments against souls as well. If you take the idea we're combating to be the idea that there's a soul in there, sort of responsible for your personal traits. And one I rather like is the something called a chimera. So a chimera is an outwardly normal-looking individual that has the genetic constitution of 2 different fertilized eggs inside them. So, on rare occasions, you can get sort of a person with 1 brown eye and 1 green and 1 blue eye, or something, you know.
Yes. There's freedom dogs like that.
But what the problem with this, the problem this poses for religious people is: does that person have 1 soul or 2? If the soul comes about at conception, and this person has got 2 fertilized embryos that sort of fuse together and develop, does he have 2 souls?
Yes.
And there's another problem with conjoined twins, where, namely, that imagine, and this again relates to sort of consciousness, actually. So you could imagine 2 twins that are fused at the hand, and they're a lot of intents and purposes, separate people.
Mm-hmm.
But what about 2 where they share the same brain? Are they the same person or different? It's very, very difficult to, if they share 1% of a brain, maybe you could snip the 2 apart and not do too much damage and have 2 quite different people. And a further line of evidence comes from split brain patients. There's a neurologist called V.S. Ramachandran, and he described a case where a split brain patient, someone who has the corpus callosum, the fiber joining the 2 halves of their brain, cut, and 1 half of the brain believed in God and the other half didn't.
Yes.
So, what happens to them on Judgment Day? Does half of them go to heaven and half of them go to hell? and you can make sense of this from a physical perspective.
Not theological.
And just as you can make sense of all that from a physical perspective, I mean, that's it stops short of like an absolute proof, but I would say the burden of proof lies on those who believe that another realm is needed as well. You know, go back to Occam's razor. Naturalism does a pretty good job. Yes, there are gaps in our knowledge, and there might be things that just can't we can't relate to anything else. Because there's nothing else like them, but that doesn't mean the fact that we can't explain them doesn't mean they can't be explained. There is no explanation. But as I say, I think that the physicalism's got a good track record. It's sort of, so I'm going with that at the moment. You know. A working hypothesis.
My viewpoint is that we can conceive of both the natural and the supernatural, but we can only find evidence for the natural. So from that moment on, the supernatural is in a bit of a catch-up position to try and obtain credibility.
Well, I think when you talk about sort of evidence for the supernatural, you have to ask what would count as sufficient evidence. Because if, let's say, if I prayed for something and that I wanted and then got it the next day, that would be consistent with the idea that my prayer worked. So it's not that there's no evidence that prayer works. You know, it does appear to work for some people sometimes. But what about all the cases where it didn't work? Did you factor that in? So when I wouldn't want to say there's no evidence for the supernatural. I think a better way of phrasing it is there's not enough to point out that there are different ways of interpreting evidence. As I say, if I pray for something and get it, well, that's consistent with the supernatural, but it's also consistent with luck. Well, it depends on what you pray for, I suppose. If I prayed for something incredibly supernatural that no one could explain and it happened, that would be strong evidence. But
that would only be an anecdote. There was one instance, including just you as a specimen. So that would only be an anecdote, and that's not generally accepted as strong evidence.
No, it's evidence, and there might be, if you're trying to establish something very weak, it might be all the evidence you need. But if you're trying to establish something very debatable, then anecdotal evidence isn't enough. It's not reasonable to rely on it. It's not strong enough to rely on.
We'll be getting into the STEP investigation that was conducted by the Templeton Foundation soon.
Yes. Well, they actually found that prayer could make things worse.
Yes.
If you knew you were being prayed for, it appeared to, I wouldn't say it made it worse, but it was associated with a worse outcome. And the researchers in that study speculated that people were thinking, oh, God, I'm being prayed for. I must be in a really bad state. You know, and they knew they were being prayed for. This doesn't look
Please don't pray for me.
It stressed them out.
Yes.
Which is so actually the idea that prayer might make things worse, the sort of which is an interesting idea.
Anyway, they spent $2.4 million failing to prove what they desperately wanted to prove, being a Christian organization.
Well, they'll keep going, won't they? Unfortunately.
Anyway, let's just take a finishing look at Steven Pinker. He's got these other pieces of evidence. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, functional nuclear magnetic resonance, all of these things. The brain is a chemical device. Psychoactive drugs can influence it. Stroke, an external injury, can cause changes in inability or even personality, or even death, of course. Brain surgery, deliberate ablation of tissue can produce predictable effects. Complexity. The brain has 100 billion neurons with 1,000 trillion connections. That's enough for a mind. Organization, we know that the neurons are arranged into gates, like like the components of a processor.
Yes.
And of course, when a brain dies, the person is gone. So the conclusion is that consciousness is there inside the brain as part of what it does in the same way.
I think they all point to that conclusion. They all sort of logically prove it, because you could all, with logical certainty, because you could always come up with a contrived explanation, like Leibniz's one.
Yeah.
You know, Leibniz might say, "Oh, I admit all that brain imaging stuff, but there's still a spiritual being there as well in parallel, and God keeps the two in parallel." Yes. And that's just like the idea that, well, okay, it looks like my engine is petrol driven, but I'm still going to say there are spirits in there pushing it.
Yes.
It's so contrived, and it raises the problem of how the spiritual and the physical interact, which is never addressed.
This is getting more complicated with hybrid cars, isn't it? Because not only do they have a petrol engine, but they have motors in the hubs of wheels as well.
There are two kinds of spirits in the hybrid cars: one pushing the petrol engine, one pushing the electric one.
Frank's come out of the game. What about this? Consciousness is an emergent, existentially dependent, immaterial product of a functioning material brain. And when the brain that is producing consciousness dies, the consciousness vanishes. I can't argue with that.
I'll be careful with the word. I think I'm not quite sure about the word product. It's got multiple meanings. So product can mean that which is produced by, meaning a result, but product also has a sort of solid sounding, a definite thing. I don't think it's a product in that sense. I think it's a product in terms of, I'd rather have the word result there. Existential. Oh, could I just see the rest of it? Sorry, it flashed off.
Outcome as an alternative word.
Yeah, outcome, because product sounds quite solid, you know, and I wouldn't. It sounds like it's a lumpy thing, and
we're quibbling with your wording, Frank.
No, that's not. You know, I just wanted to. Yes, I mean, I think when the brain dies, well, actually, yeah, consciousness vanishes. When we walk again is an interesting question. In a brain that's recently dead, how long? Well, I say dead. The problem is that the activity persists in the center of the brain, and that activity is not usually measured, because you don't want to stick needles into or electrodes into deep into people's heads. You don't want to do it at all, really. But you don't want to stick a needle deep into someone's head unless you really have to. And this has led to sort of stories of people coming back from the dead. Oh, the doctors said their brain, they came back from the dead. Well, they weren't measuring necessarily the activity in the depth of their brain. They were measuring it on the surface. And it's possible to
most likely the explanation is they never really died.
Yes, they sort of, yes.
So we've got a question here from Diana. Hello, Diana. What happens in cases of dementia?
Well, I don't know the detail of that, but there are. Well, I mean, in cases like what's it called, Alzheimer's, there's sort of what are called amyloid plaques in the brain that disrupt. I don't exactly know how they do it, but they're sort of tangled proteins that appear in the brain, and it's therefore not surprising that the brain is screwed up. I don't know the detail of exactly what happens, mind you. So, sorry, my TV is about to go into standby. I just need to stop it. Right, good. Yes, I don't know the detail, but there are physical correlates of there are physical changes happening in the brain, and that's consistent with the changes in dementia. It's interesting how different regions seem to be affected in different ways. So, for example, long-term memory seems to be less affected than short-term. You know, people often go, "What happened in their childhood?" So there are, and dementia is another issue when it comes to, you know, why should a person, an elderly person who's demented, suddenly come back good as new in heaven? You know, how does that? The whole idea of heaven is appealing to some people because it offers a sort of continuity. But what happens if you're in a not in a very good state just when you die? You know, it's.
Do you be continuing in that near-death condition. Of course, they might argue that you can be reincarnated in heaven at an earlier stage of your life when the prospects were much better.
Yeah, certainly. Well, just to answer Diane's point, in dementia is the brain dead? It certainly isn't dead. No, it's still doing stuff.
Interesting though, because it's
not doing it as well as it used to.
No.
But then the same could be said of lots of other parts of the body as you get older. You know, your muscles wear out, and I don't have a detailed explanation of how dementia, how the physical changes cause dementia, but I would say at a general level it's consistent with the idea that we're discussing here, namely that consciousness or brain activity gives rise to feelings and consciousness.
And it's a physical change that brings about this mental change.
Yes.
And it's topical at the moment, isn't it? Because the poor footballers who won the World Cup for us back in the 60s, many of them have got dementia now, thanks to heading the heavy old balls that they used to have.
Yes, but it's a tricky one but if you're going to kick up a fuss about heading a ball, what about boxing? You know, whether the purpose of the sport is lots of people want to knock someone out, want someone to be knocked out.
Yes, well,
I think people can wear like shields and stuff, but
it's not going to help. It's not going to help because it's not a case of bruising; it's a case of the movement and sudden. So it's like a jelly inside a pudding basin. If you wobble it about, you'll get smushed jelly.
Yes, I mean, I think I suppose there are costs to everything that people do, and you can reduce the amount of heading in practice, which I think they're doing now for football.
Yes.
It's an interesting question how much you should curtail certain things. I suppose, you know, if people don't, people are doing too little physical exercise, most people, you know, to be a bit of a generalization, but there are risks of not doing enough exercise if you want to live longer. But having said that, dementia is a very, it can really spoil the life of the person who experiences it, their quality of life, and it can change them as a person substantially. My grandmother had it, and it was very difficult to live with.
Yes.
She was wakeful and kept sort of yelling at night, and keeping everybody else awake, and it was a very unpleasant to watch her kind of go through it. And it was a relief when it was over, frankly.
It's very sad because they still occupy the husk. Their outside body still exists, but the person has gone from inside. So what about this? This is anecdotal evidence may establish an idea such as prayer as valid personally, but the point would be that would that be sufficient for the religious disposition? The motivation to religion is initially personal, but when an association is made with others with the same experiences, it becomes tribal, and that phenomenon takes over orthodoxies and mantras, etc.
Well, I suppose religion often encourages people not to be critical of claims about that religion. You know, take the doubting Thomas story, which says it's better to believe without evidence than it is to have seen it or requested it. You know, blessed are those who have believed and not seen.
Yes.
And yet they would never, religious people never say that faith is wonderful when it comes to validating the worldviews of rivals.
No.
It's not faith that they prize, it's faith in it's not faith at all they prize. No. Otherwise I could just counter their faith in creationism by saying I have faith in evolution. It's trust in their own position that they use faith. They don't have faith in everything. They have faith in their own and not everybody else's. So they misuse. We all need trust to some degree, but they firstly they rely on trust too much and are apt to be misled. And secondly, they don't use trust consistently. don't demand high standards of evidence when it comes to validating their own position, but they do demand importantly high standards when it comes to validating an opponent's. So, for example, someone will say, show me every step in an evolutionary process, every single little step before I believe it evolved. If you can't tell me exactly how this structure evolved, exactly which mutation happened when, I'm not going to believe you.
And then you're the one with faith, because you've accepted it despite these tiny gaps.
Well, exactly. Well, they're tiny gaps, and that's the key word. So it's faith, it's trust, but there are degrees of trust. And to liken my faith in evolution to faith in Noah's Ark or something, well, I don't know everything about evolution. I don't understand everything about how it works, but it does. It's the best view we've got, and it does a pretty good job. And therefore, it takes less faith to believe in that than it does to believe in a rival view. And similarly, if I take an object and release it, it takes a little bit of faith to believe it will fall down. You know, perhaps the law of gravity will stop working for some reason that no one's aware of. But it takes more faith to assume it won't. You know, you can't get away from trust completely, but sensible people do minimize a reliance on it, because you can always ask someone to trust me. You can't get away from a degree of trust, but I think reasonable people look critically at stuff. That's skepticism for you, isn't it, really?
Yes, indeed. That's why we're here. Diana says, on the subject of heaven, Christians believe that on death or on meeting their God, the body is suddenly made perfect as it was meant to be before the fall in Eden.
Well, actually, even in the Bible story, even before the fall, they obviously wouldn't have been perfect, or they wouldn't have sinned and done the wrong thing. You know, perfect beings don't sin, do they? Another problem there is that the achievement of perfection wasn't sort of built into bodies. It was made conditional on eating the fruit eating the fruit of the tree of life to kind of recharge their batteries. And people died, according to the Genesis account, because they were kept from reaching the tree of life. So death was still a thing. The potential for death was still a thing even before the fall in the Bible, if you read it carefully. It's not that people they had the potential to eat forever, but they had to eat a magic fruit to kind of recharge their batteries. So even there, the default was, unless you eat the magic fruit, you die, which is a bit strange. So it wasn't as perfect as people think it was.
And are we ever perfect to be remade perfect in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, because what would happen if you're a very young embryo and you've died?
Yes.
Do you come back as an embryo in heaven? How does that work? These questions, they really do make they help you see why it's such a dodgy idea.
Yes.
Other ones like those, you know, the thought experiments involving the conjoined twins, and they all ask really. I like those kind of thought experiments because I like asking awkward questions.
Well, that's right. Yes, making people think is very good practice for making them come to conclusions about their beliefs.
Yes, I mean, I found actually when I moved away from when I stopped doing the scientific research, because I no longer had access to all the scientific journals. You can get access to some of them for free on the internet, you know. But when I had less access to the experiments people were doing, I began to think more. There's a joke I like, which is what do you call a scientist who runs out of data? A philosopher. And a little bit harsh, but you can see where he's coming from. That if you can't do experiments in the lab, you can think about doing experiments.
Yes,
a bit like the difference between introspection, which doesn't require laboratory equipment, and cognitive psychology, and brain scanning and stuff.
Well, on that note, I mean, I know a couple of philosophers who I'm pretty sure will have heard that expression about being scientists who lack data. So we've overrun our timing.
Oh, right.
You've been so fascinating, and questions are still coming in, and people are still viewing from different parts of the world. But I'm going to call it to an end now because it's my bedtime. So, okay. Thanks a lot, Robert.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it, and I've putting the talk together. I've learned some stuff myself. Actually, it's made me think about things, which is always good.
Well, yeah, absolutely. This is why we're here to explore and to learn. Yes. On that note, I shall play the outro. Thank you for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.